Hey everybody, welcome back to part 3 of our Minecraft Tower Defense coding tutorial. We're learning how to code a fun Minecraft themed computer game in Scratch. Last week in part 2, we got our creepers coded, but their explosions weren't destroying the surrounding walls. So we're going to start with that. Then we're going to teach our Steves to fight back with physics-based bow and arrows. If you've just discovered this tutorial series, I'd encourage you to go back and start at part 1. You can find the link right up there in the corner. And if you do want to start coding from right here, you can load a catch-up file that has all the code that we did in parts 1 and 2. You can find a link to it in the description down below. Make sure to like and subscribe for more amazing Scratch tutorials. Let's get right to it. Hey, so welcome back to part 3 of our Minecraft Tower Defense tutorial. We left last week with a little bit of unfinished business, which was we were able to build these walls and the creepers were able to walk up to them and explode, but the actual walls weren't exploding when the creepers exploded. So you can see here the creepers make a very satisfying explosion, but they don't do anything to the walls in their way. So that's the first thing we're going to fix today. Let's go have a look at our creeper code and we'll get started right there. So inside our creeper, we have this red custom block called act as a creeper, and this is the area of code that actually affects the explosion. Right down here towards the bottom, once the explosion is triggered, you'll see a repeat until costume number equals 30, and that's actually walking the creeper through its animations. So you can see there's some motion animations here that get the creeper moving, and then it switches to this explosion animation that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It reaches its peak size right around here at around 13 or so, and so that's when we're going to trigger the actual destruction of the wall. So what we want to do is wait until the explosion advances to a certain point, and then we need to remove the blocks that are in the area of the explosion. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to start with an if statement here. So we're going to say if, so right underneath the next costume here inside the repeat until, we're going to say if costume number equals 15, so if our explosion has, 14, so we'll put a 14 in there, and we'll grab a costume number from our looks commands here down towards the bottom, costume number. So if our costume number equals 14, if our explosion has advanced far enough, we want to store where our explosion is happening. So we need to know where on the screen the walls are supposed to be destroyed. So we've got a variable in here, which may not be in your working file here. It's called explosion x. So let's set variable explosion x, and we're going to make that the x position of the creeper. So let's go to our motion blocks. Towards the bottom here, we'll grab an x position. There we go. So that will just store the x position of the creeper that's exploding. And this is the moment the explosion is considered to be active. It's only for one frame it's going to be active here. So we've got a variable called set explosion active to 1. So for that one moment when the explosion is active, that's when we're going to delete the surrounding walls. And then immediately after, we're going to flip that variable back to 0 again. So underneath this if statement, we're putting a second if statement. And I'm just going to grab this equal to sign and do a duplicate of it. There we go. If costume number equals 15, so if we're on the next costume, we're just going to set that explosion active back to 0 again. All right, so that's all the code we need in the creeper to make the walls disappear. Now let's go to the actual wall blocks. So I'm going to flip over to the variable called wall block. You'll recall that it looks like a piece of cobblestone when it's not a probe here. All right, so in here, we've got a when I started the clone block here that all it does right now is it makes the block fully visible and switches it back to a cobblestone costume, which is what we want. And Inside here, we wanted to just start checking forever to see whether it's been exploded or not. So we'll put a forever block. And we need an if statement here. We're going to do a little bit of math here, basically to determine how far the current X position of the wall block is from the X position of the explosion. Now, we're not concerned with Y because it doesn't really matter how high or how low a block is. If a creeper hits it at ground level, it'll destroy that entire stack. So we're not interested in Y at all. So what we are looking for is, we're looking for our current X position. This is the X position of the wall block. And we're looking for the explosion X, which is the location of the explosion. So let's grab an explosion X bubble. And we want to subtract X position from explosion X. So let's do a minus sign here. So we're just trying to find out what the absolute distance is away here. Now, this could end up being a positive number or a negative number, and we're just interested in how far they are away from each other. So if we take the absolute value of that number, we're going to grab the ABS absolute value block from our green blocks here. So absolute value just takes a negative number and makes it positive, and it takes a positive number and makes it positive as well. And so that way we'll find the distance, and regardless of whether it's a negative number or a positive number, it'll still end up being the same number. So if that number is less than the distance that we want our explosion to be active, and we're going to call that 45 pixels. So if this, I'm going to grab all of this and put it into the less than 45. So if the distance to the explosion is less than, well, actually it's 48 here in the code. 48. So if that's true and the explosion is actually active, if we're on that one frame of animation where the explosion's happening, so we're going to say explosion active, let's go find that variable, is equal to 1. Now I'm going to take all of the rest of that code and put it inside the AND here. So let's drag it over. There we go. So we've got a nice big green block here. Let's check in to see whether a block should explode or not. So that all goes into the if statement. And if that statement is true, if both those things are actually happening, then we get to delete the block. So let's go to our control, and we'll grab the delete this clone block. Okay, so that's all there is to it. Let's try play testing our game here again. We'll wait for a creeper to arrive. Meanwhile, I'll go harvest some stone, because I'm going to need some stone to build some walls here. And let's just see how big that explosion is. So we'll wait for our first creeper to arrive on the scene. Here he is on the right-hand side. So I'm going to build a wall here. I'll build it too high, which means that the zombies can't climb it. And I'm just going to build it a little deeper here. I'll build it 3 deep, maybe 4 deep here. And we'll see how big the explosion is. So here we go. Creeper's going to explode. It's going to blow. Yeah, and it got rid of the first 2 rows of blocks there and left the other ones. Of course, the zombies are able to climb these because they're only 1 high. Perfect. And the creeper will ignore this first block as well. I'm just going to gather a little bit more stone here. I'm going to make this one too high. So here we go. So in this case, the creeper is going to climb 1 and then explode, because I'm going to put 1 more block on top here. There we go. Everything's working exactly the way that I want it to, perfectly. And that entire block blows up. Beautiful. Okay. So there we go. Our creepers are exploding nicely now. Okay, so the rest of the tutorial here is mostly going to be about how to shoot at these new mobs that we've set up. And that actually involves 3 different sprites. We've got our archer sprite down here at the bottom, who is just basically a Steve character in profile here. We're going to attach this bow to him, and it's going to be able to tilt depending on the direction that you're aiming. And so you can see there's animations here to show him drawing the bow back and then firing it forward. And then lastly, we have the arrow, which is going to fly loose from that bow and hopefully destroy our enemies before they can get us. So that's going to involve some fairly complex physics, but we'll get to that in a bit. So we're starting with the archer character, who's the character that we're actually going to place on the screen here. And the placement algorithm here is going to be very similar to what we did for the walls. We're going to be turning our Steve into a probe and then shifting him around to see if he's able to actually be placed on an area. So we're going to be asking questions like, am I standing at ground level? Am I standing on top of a wall? Am I standing on top of another Steve, for example? And if all those questions are satisfied properly, then we'll be able to place an archer, and then he'll be active on the screen. So we're inside the archer sprite here. Let's start with a green flag. And we just have to set a few things up as we usually do when we start with a new sprite. Now we're using a list here in a little bit called archer indexes that's going to keep track of which archer is which. And we'll be getting a little bit more into that later. But but we want each of our archers to have a number associated with them, and that's called archer index. So there's a variable here called new archer index. So let's go set new archer index to 0. And so that number is the number that's going to be attached to each archer that's created. And this is going to go up with each archer that we make. Okay, so we have that list. Let's go down to our list commands here. The first thing we want to do is delete the entire old list from our last game, just to make sure it's all good. So we're going to delete all of archer indexes, and then we can start a fresh list here of our new archers. We're going to switch our costume to a probe. Again, we don't want our entire sprite to be on the screen when we're probing around to see which sprite it is, whether we're overlapping on top of another sprite, because there's just too much danger of them accidentally overlapping on each other. So we really want to know precisely whether this guy is on top of an existing guy and not just on the edge of him. And so that's why we changed to a probe to make ourselves smaller. You can see the probe costume here is quite tiny, and it's just a little bit offset from the center here. So if this dot isn't touching another archer, then we'll know for sure that we can place it. Okay, we're going to clear graphic effects here under our looks commands, just because later on we might be adding some ghost effect or something along those lines to it. I don't remember exactly what it was in this case. All right, now we've got one big loop here, so let's go forever. And this is the code for placing our object. So we're going to sandwich everything inside of this forever loop is all going to happen within one frame. And so we're going to show our object right now. It's not really going to be visible because right at the end of it, we're going to add a hide as well. And all the rest of the code is going to be sandwiched in between it. I'm not going to need this right now. So it's just going to show for long enough to evaluate whether this guy can be placed or not. And then it's going to hide again. And it's only the clone that will actually be visible on the screen. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is align our cursor to the screen again. So we're going to tell this archer character, or the probe of the archer, to align itself to the screen. Now we've been talking for a few weeks now about this grid system. I'm going to grab a go to XY, and I'm not going to explain it again because I've done it in part 1 and in part 2 here, but we're going to align this guy to the grid by taking the mouse X and dividing it by 16. And then we're finding the floor of that number, which is rounding it down. So I'm going to go to the ABS here and change it to floor. So the floor of mouse X divided by 16, multiply that by 16. Whoops. So you got to grab these carefully if you don't want them to fall apart. Multiply that by 16. And then offset it a little bit to fit properly, and that will be adding 8 to it. So let's drop that in there, plus 8. Okay, so that's our X coordinate, and this little bit of code will make it so that our mouse clicks on the X axis always line up to our grid. We're going to do the same thing for the Y, so we're going to grab mouse Y from our sensing blocks. We're going to divide it by, we're going to offset it a little bit here. So mouse Y minus 4. And we're going to divide that by 16. And then we're going to find the ceiling of that. So instead of the floor, we're just going to find the ceiling. And then we're going to multiply that by 16 again. Oh, I can always get my multiplication and my addition blocks confused with each other. Okay, there we go. Multiply that by 16. And then we're going to subtract 12 from it. So I was talking to Jeffrey about this, and he says a lot of these numbers were just arrived at by trial and error. He just fiddled stuff around so that the grid always aligned exactly in the center. So these offsets here, they were just basically determined through a trial and error process. Okay, so we go pop that into there. And so I think we should be able to see our object now. So let's go click the, and you can see that there's a little dot following us around the screen here. I'm going to switch it back to the other costume just so you can see it a little better. And so here's my archer. You can see that he's perfectly aligned with the ground here. And we can position him on this 16 by 16 grid so that he fits exactly with the surrounding area. Okay, so far so good. Let's change that code back to probe again because we actually want a probe here. All right, so now we're waiting for a mouse click. Let's go grab an if statement. And we're going to say if our mouse is down and a bunch of stuff. So actually we need two and statements here. So we need, let's grab an and then put an and inside that. We're going to structure this properly first, and then we'll modify it a little bit. And the last and is going to need a not inside it. And then inside that, we're going to put an or statement. Okay, we got the skeleton of this complex if statement all set up here, and I'll explain it as we go along. So the first thing we need on the left here is a mouse down. Let's go to our sensing block. So we're going to be wait for a mouse click. So if we've clicked our mouse and our Y position is greater than 50, which means that we're above ground level. That's what Y of 50 is here. So we're going to go Y position under our motion blocks is greater than 50. And we'll pop that into the left one here. And we're not touching an archer. So let's go to our sensing blocks and we'll go touching archer. Now again, we don't have touching archer here because we already are an archer. You might remember I showed you the hack for that last week. We have to actually go over to a different sprite and go grab a touching block, and that one will say touching archer. We'll drag that back to our archer again. So now we actually have a block that says touching archer, which Scratch wasn't going to let us do. All right, if we're touching archer or touching wall block. So let's grab another touching wall block. There we go. Okay, so let's zoom back here and have a look at this. So I'll just make this a bit smaller. It's quite a bit of code. So if I'm clicking my mouse and my mouse is above ground level and I'm not touching an archer or a wall block, so those are the two things that I can't place an archer on top of, then we've passed the first layer of this test basically. So it looks right now pretty good for us to be able to place an archer down here because all these things are true, and then we'll go down to the next level. And I have a feeling that this is an if-else statement. No, it's not. Okay, good. Just double checking that. All right. Now, later on, we're going to be checking a variable called temp to make sure whether we're allowed to place our object or not, and that's just something that you'll see in a second here. So at the beginning, though, we're going to set our temp variable to 0, just because we haven't passed all the official tests here to make a archer yet. All right, so now another layer of testing here. Underneath here, we're going to put an if-else statement. So let's go control if-else. So the next thing we're checking for here is whether we're trying to place our object on top of the house or not. It's an if-else statement instead of an if statement, because even if it is on top of the house, we can still place an archer, but we'll have to place him up higher. It can't be inside the house. So we can tell whether he's in the house by his x coordinate. So we're going to check and see. We're going to grab an or statement here. And we're going to say if our x position is greater than a certain value or less than a certain value. I'm going to grab a couple of x positions here. So if our x position is greater than 49, meaning to the right of the house, or our x position is less than minus 55, which means we're to the left of the house, then we can start to probe here. So we're not on the house, but now we need to see whether we're on the ground or whether we're up in the air and on top of a wall, basically. So we need to change our y coordinate. We went into probing last week. Let's go change y by minus 16. And we're going to do one last check here again. So we need an if statement inside this if statement, right down below the change y. So if down below us we're touching a wall block, that means that by default that we're standing on top of a wall block, or if we're on the ground. So let's grab an or statement here. So if the spot below us, after we've probed downward, is touching a wall block, and again, oh yeah, here we go, touching wall block. Where's my wall block? Here it is. Or our y position is equal to 36, which is right here, motion. So if our y position is equal to 36, that means that the spot below us is underground, basically. Or there's a wall block below us. In either case, that means that we're going to be able to place a block here. So we're going to change that variable. Let's go set temp to 1. So that means that we're going to be able to place that archer in that spot. And later on, we're going to get below this script here, we're going to add the guy. But for now, we just want to set that variable to let us know that we are able to place a block. Okay, so after the if statement here, we're going to stop our probing. So we're going to change our y again. Change y by 16. Okay, so that covers what happens if we're not on top of the house. We're going to check and see whether we're standing on a wall or whether we're standing at ground level. We've already figured that out. Now, if we are inside the house, there's still a chance for us to put an archer down because we can be on the roof. So what we're going to do now is check and see whether our y position, so let's go control if our y position is equal to 116, and that's the level it will be at if we're at roof level. So let's go grab a y is equal to 116. Then we just got to move our character up a little bit. We're going to go change our y by 8. And that will align it properly with the roof. You might have seen earlier when we were trying to place our object, it was kind of embedded in the roof here, and that moving that up will align it properly with the roof. And we're going to set that variable temp to 1. And again, that's going to tell us we're clear to place an archer in that spot. Okay, so we've finished all these checks to determine if we're allowed now to place our archer. And if that temp variable has been set to 1 and some other conditions are true, then we should be able to start placing that sprite down. So we're going to need one more if statement here to check and see whether that temp is 1. So we use this temp variable because there's 2 different spots here you can see where we would be allowed to build a archer. So we could have put all the code for what happens when you build an archer in here, but then we would have had to repeat it here inside this if statement. So by changing this variable, now underneath it we can send one if statement that covers both circumstances. And so that's why we've set it up that way. Okay, so I'm going to go grab an if statement for my control blocks, if, and so you have to place this very carefully. It's going to go basically, there's 4 layers of blocks here. It's going to go right in the middle of them. So I'm going to place this down just like this here. You can see that there's now 2 blocks above and 2 blocks below the if statement. There we go. So just look at this very carefully and make sure you place it properly or this will not work. Okay, so now inside our if statement, we were going to check for a whole bunch of things. We're going to do 3 AND statements in a row here. So let's go ahead and grab an AND nest it inside an AND nest that inside of an AND. So we're checking for 4 different things right now. So the first thing we need is an equal sign here. So on the left here, we're going to check that temp variable. If our temp variable is equal to 1, whoops, and I just pulled it all apart here. This happens a lot when you're messing around with these very complex blocks with lots of pieces in them. Okay, so if our temp variable is set to 1, which means we've been given the OK to place a guy, and if we have enough money, so we're going to say if our gold is less than or equal to 2, and you might remember that the hack way to do that inside Scratch, and I showed this to you last week, is if I say that if my gold collected is not less than 2, so that means I have 2 or more blocks, right? So we're going to say gold collected is not less than 2. So if I have 2 or more blocks, let's put that into the second slot in the AND statement. And again, I rip this apart. This is just going to keep happening to me, I'm sure. There we go. Now in the third AND section here, we're going to check and see whether we are in defense block selected mode. So this is a variable that determines whether we're placing walls or whether we're placing defense blocks, which is our archers, right? So let's have a look at that. We'll grab an equal in there and pop it into the third AND statement. So we'll say if defense block selected equals 1. So later on, we'll be setting up some buttons at the top of the screen that will determine whether we're building blocks or whether we're building walls or whether we're building archers. So if we've selected archer building mode, then of course we'll be building archers. And the last thing is shooting mode active. So even if we're on our building archers block, we might already have existing archers on the screen, and sometimes we'll want to click to shoot them instead of clicking to place new archers. So we've got this toggle that we're going to set up later with the space key, where every time we hit the space key, it turns into a shooting mode where our characters start to fire at that point. So we have to make sure that that's in the proper place. We're going to say shooting mode active. And that is not a variable that's contained in your starter file. So let's go ahead and create a variable here. Call it shooting mode active. So if shooting mode active is equal to 0, which means we're not firing, we're placing. if shooting mode active is equal to 0. There we go. All right, so that's all the stuff we're checking. And if that all checks out, then we're going to do a bunch of stuff here that all has to do with placing our characters. Well, let's just test this out for starters. So before I fill this out, we're just going to create a clone of myself in here, just so we can test this. Now, this still isn't going to work because when we click up top here, it's still going to think that we're clicking to create walls. We're going to have to go back to our wall code. Let me just demonstrate that for you guys. So when I try to click here to place an archer, it will place a wall down because we're still in wall building mode, and we're going to have to fiddle with the wall code a little bit to get it so that it doesn't build walls by default. So let's go back to our wall block code, and we've got an if statement towards the bottom of our green flag statement here. We're checking to see if we have enough stone, and if we've selected defense block, which would be 0 in this case, we need one more and statement in there to check and see whether we're in shooting mode or not. So let's go ahead and grab an and. I'm going to pick all this up and pop it into this and so that I have one more slot. And let's put it back into the if statement very carefully. And so now I'm going to say if shooting mode active equals 0. All right, so if our defense block selected is equal to 0 and our shooting mode active is equal to 0, then we won't be building wall blocks. And so we're going to set up some buttons to toggle that. But for now, we're just going to manually fix those just so we can test the building of archers. So my shooting mode active is now 0. My defense block mode is active is 0, which means we're building blocks. Let's go back to our archer. Now it's checking to see if defense block selected is equal to 1. So I'm going to change that variable around. Set defense block to 1. Now this is just a temporary thing. It's not part of our final game. I just want to change that variable around so that we can see this in action. And we're creating a clone of ourselves, but we do have to get that clone to be wearing the right costume when we place it. So let's go ahead and do a when I started the clone and tell our new costume to go and switch to costume archer. Okay, there we go. So I think we should be ready to test this now. Let's go ahead and click the green flag. So you see that we have a dot here appearing on the screen that's determining, okay. Now I have 2 gold here, so I should be able to place an archer, and there we go. My archer is now placed. Let's gather a little bit more gold so we can place another archer. You can see that if I try to place the archer in the air, it's not working. If I try to place it on the roof, though, okay, I'm going to get rid of that variable. I think it's in the way here. There we go. I got rid of those roof variables. Let's see if I can place this up on the roof now. I've got enough gold. And there we go. We've placed a guy on the roof now as well. Perfect. So we can't place them inside the house. I still have enough gold collected here. I can't place him underground. I can't place him up in the sky. But when I'm at ground level, poof, he appears. So everything's working beautifully now. Okay, we are ready to move on here. Okay, so we've tested out this script and it seems to be working properly. It's creating a clone of the spot where I click, which is perfect, as long as the conditions are correct. Okay, the next thing we need to do is create a system in here that will allow Scratch to keep track of which clone is which. As we create more of these archers, they're all going to function independently, each one of them shooting its same arrows, and they're going to be able to die independently as well. But how does Scratch keep track of which clones are alive and which ones are dead? They don't really have a separate identification system for clones inside Scratch. If you want to delete a clone, it usually is going to, the delete this clone block will just address all the clones at once. And you, of course, only want to be dealing with the one of them at a time. So we're creating this index system, and we're going to do it using a list. So the index system is just going to number off all of these characters. We're going to create a temporary variable called new archer index. You can see that at the top of the screen here. New archer index, and that's going to be the number that's given to each clone. And we're going to keep track of all the clones on a list, and it's a list called archer indexes. So lists, you'll recall, are kind of like variables, except they can contain multiple entries. So we can have a number here, and then another number in the next row, and another number in the next row, like that. So we're going to basically keep track of how many archers are on the screen and what numbers they are using this index list here. So we've already initialized these two variables up at the top of the screen here. We've gone set new archer index to 0, and then clear off that old archer indexes list at the start of each game. So once we get down here, before we actually create a clone of ourselves, what we're going to want to do is make some modifications to this list and to that variable new archer index. So we'll start off with a set variable here, right above create a clone, and we're going to call it set new archer index. Oh, actually, we're going to change the variable here. Sorry. So I'll get rid of that. We're going to change new archer index by 1. So that first time through this loop, it'll number the first archer 1, etc., etc. Okay, so we're going to add that number 1 to our list. So we're going to go down to our darker reddish brown list commands here, and I'm going to grab this one that says add thing to archer indexes. We're not adding thing though, of course, we're adding new archer index. So whatever that first number is, we're going to add it to the list here, and then create a clone of myself. So there was a problem with the original version of this file, and I suspect if you're working on an older version of my template, you might not have this fixed. So if you go back to your archer and look at the dot, the original dot placement was for the probe costume on this archer was down here at the bottom right of the center. We don't want that. We want to move the dot kind of above the center of this dot. So this little crosshair here actually represents where the archer's feet are. So we want to create a collision zone here, a little bit bigger. We'll just stretch out this a little bit. We can keep it skinny. So it has to be able to overlap with the zombies, with the archer down below it, so that we will know that if it's intersecting, that we can't create a new archer, basically. If the dot appears below the archer, then we'll be able to keep putting new archers in the spot, which is not what we want. So if you change this way, we can carry on with our code here. All right, so we want to keep track of the X and Y location of that new archer, and we're going to do something with that in a little bit as well. So I'm going to set a variable here, set new archer X, and we're also going to set new archer Y here. So we're going to keep track of the new archer's X and Y coordinates, and the X coordinate is going to be the X position. So set new archer X becomes the current X position of the object. And we have to do a bit of math here because we're actually looking a little bit above. So remember the archer is his location is actually the bottom of his feet. And we want his location in this formulation here to be the center of the character. So we're going to take his existing Y position and add to it. So let's add a plus in there. There's my plus. So we're going to go Y position plus 20. There we go. So that will temporarily store the new archer's Y position as the center of the character rather than the bottom of his feet. And we've got an X position here as well. Good. Now after that is where we create a clone of ourselves. So let's just move this around a little bit. We're also going to create a clone of our bow. We've got an object here called archer bow, and each archer is going to have his own bow. So let's create a clone of that right now as well. Create clone of archer bow. Right there. Now we have a little sound effect to play every time that we get that we buy a new archer, and that's a little cash register sound here. So we're just going to play that sound. Let's go to our sounds and we'll go start sound, buy sound. Okay, so now every time we buy an archer, we'll get that sound effect. We also want to take our money away here because we're spending money on these guys. So let's go change gold collected by -2, and that's the cost of our archers. If you are interested in changing around the difficulty of this game, though, of course you might want to go with a different number here. Okay, so we're pretty much ready to test our archer placement right now. One thing I wanted to warn you guys, though, is if you started with an earlier version of this starter file, we made a minor change to it. So I need you guys to confirm that this sprite is right. We've got this probe sprite here, which is what our archer turns into when we're trying to figure out where to place him. And this probe has to be aligned properly. In an earlier version, there was a little dot that was over on the right-hand side of this crosshair, this cursor here in the middle of the screen. And because that represents where the archer's feet are, this isn't actually going to line up properly. So if you have a circle like this down below this crosshair, just go ahead and drag it above the crosshair and then stretch it out a little bit like this so that it's kind of roughly maybe half the height of the archer. So this is what's going to overlap on top of other archers to let us know that we can't place one archer on top of another. So if you've got that lined up properly, we've still got one more problem going on here, but let me show this to you right now. I'm going to start my project. And you can see that it is now trying to place this little sprite down on the screen somewhere. And it will place an archer there. And you can see the number here, but it might not reliably work all the time. I'm going to hit the space bar. I just set it up to give myself an extra 100 gold whenever that happens. And yes, I am placing things properly here, and I can't place them on top of themselves. But if I try and place this on the roof, I might run into trouble. Let's try this out. Oh, it's all actually working okay. All right. But the 4th or 5th time I did it, so sometimes you're seeing that it's creating extra items here on the index. It's because it's not detecting it properly, and it's placing 2 of them every time you click. It's complicated, but what's going on in the code here is we've got our something hovering around our cursor here that's detecting whether there's an archer there, but we did something similar with our wall block placement. We've got 2 different dots floating on top of our cursor here that are helping to determine whether we can click here or not. Those 2 can interfere with each other if they're on the screen at the same time. So remember at the beginning of this forever loop we did a show. Right at the very end we're going to place a hide so that this little red dot is only visible for the just for that 1 frame of animation here, and I don't think it'll even it'll show and hide. So everything inside this forever is all going to execute within 1 frame of animation, so it's going to show and then hide again so quickly that you'll never actually see the object. And you can see that now when I click and that I don't see that red dot anymore, and my objects are placing quite nicely here. Yeah, and every once in a while it will create, no, it looks like we're pretty good here anyway. But to just make sure we don't have a problem where we're adding archers more than once on the list here, we do have to clean up some code over in the wall block. So I'm going to go over to the wall block here. Oh, actually, I think that Jeffrey, when we were talking about this issue, he already went and fixed this for me. So just go back and confirm. So I'm in my wall block under the green flag. I want to show right here the first thing after the forever, and then a hide right before the end of the file here. So if that's inside this wall block and we have a similar show hide in the archer block, then everything should be placing properly and adding itself to this indexes list properly, and everything should be good. So that's just something we'll need to double check. Okay, so I thought we'd have time to do the bow and arrow shooting, but it turns out that's quite a bit of code. I had another look at it and decided that that's probably not the way to go for this lesson. So I'm going to push that back to next week. What I would like to do while we're still coding here, though, is we had to do a bit of hacking to get this archer placement going properly. What should be happening at the top of the screen here is we should be able to click on this object to place walls and this object to place archers and go back and forth. So that's an important component of the game. So let's go ahead and add that part now, and we'll see what our time is like as soon as we're done that. Okay, so we're inside the sprite for the wall icon. You can see it right here, and you can see that it has a couple of different costumes. One that shows when it's highlighted, when it's selected, and one when it's unselected, basically. So we're going to be toggling back and forth between these two different looks. Whenever we click on it, it's going to turn green, and that will mean that we're placing walls. And the same thing will happen with the bow. It'll turn green when we're in a position to place archers or not place them. There we go. Okay, so we're going to start coding the wall icon now. We're going to start with a green flag. So the objective here is going to make it grow and kind of wiggle a little bit when we move our mouse over it to show that it's been selected. So it's going to get bigger and kind of wiggle smoothly back and forth. We're going to use a little bit of a fancy math function, the sine function, which you might have seen before in some of my other tutorials. It's a great way to get stuff moving smoothly. Okay, let's start with the green flag here. I'm just going to set some initial variables here. So we're going to go to our variables and set shooting mode active. So we're going to be able to toggle back and forth later on between a mode where when we click, we're targeting for firing stuff at our arrows, or we're placing new archers. And we're going to go back and forth using the space key later on, but that's going to be controlled with this variable called shooting mode active. We're going to set it to 0, so we're placing stuff by default here. The other variable we need here is called a defense block selected, and we saw that one a little while ago. And so when that's set to 0, that means we're going to be building walls, and when it's set to 1, it means we're going to be placing archers, and we're going to go back and forth between that. Now we've got a third variable here called time passed. And that's simply a number that's going to keep growing, and that's going to be fed back into our wiggle code to make the wiggling happen properly. We don't need to look at that quite yet, though. Underneath that, we're going to put a forever, and we're going to start changing that variable. So let's go change variable, time passed by 1. And so you can see as soon as we start clicking this, that time passed variable is going to start going up, and it'll just continuously go up. And what number that is, the sign of that number is going to determine how far over we are in our swing as these objects rotate around. You'll see how that all works out in just a second. Okay, we're going to put a second green flag down here now, and a forever. So we don't want stuff interfering with this time passed, so we're going to put the rest of our stuff into a separate loop here. All right, so we need an if-else statement here. So if I'm touching mouse pointer, basically we're going to have two different states here. Am I hovering over it, or if not? And if I'm hovering over it, am I clicking or not? So we need a sort of nested combination of if statements here to handle that. We'll start with the if-else. So if I'm touching mouse pointer, sensing touching mouse pointer. So if I'm pointing my pointer at it, we're going to start getting bigger. So I'm going to go change size under my looks commands, change size by 2. And we want to limit the size so it doesn't get too big. I mean, right now, when I hover over it, it's going to start to get gigantic and stay that way. So we're going to put an if statement in there. It says if size is greater than 16. Let's grab a size. which is right way down here at the bottom of our purple objects. If our size is greater than 16, so if it reaches too big a size, we're going to set size to 16%. So that will max its size out at 16. Set size to 16%. There we go. So now in my code here, when I'm touching with my mouse pointer, it's not going to reset its size until I get into this else statement here. So we'll deal with that. Actually, let's code the else statement right now. So now when we're not hovering over it, it's going to shrink. So we're going to change size by -2. Look at it growing there, -2. And we're going to do something similar. I'm going to duplicate this if statement. So if size is less than, sorry, we actually need a less than rather than a greater than there. So if size is less than 10, we're establishing the minimum size here. We're going to set size to 10%. So it's going to be going back and forth between 10% and 16%, depending on whether we're hovering over it. So let me show you that right now. It's a little bit messed up, but once we run the code, so it grows and then shrinks back to size again. Excellent. So the only other thing we want to do with this here is we want to have it start to wiggle around when it's big. And then if we're clicking on it as well, we want to be able to activate the defense block. So let's do that part next. So I'm inside this main if-else statement, and then I've got an if statement here that checks the size. I'm going to put another if statement right below that. And that one's going to say if mouse down. So if I'm actually clicking here, then I'm going to set defense block selected to 0. And that will make it. Okay, so we have our block growing and shrinking based on whether we're holding our mouse over it. The next thing we're going to have to do here is get it wiggling. So we're going to be using the sign command to do that, and this is something I've covered in other tutorials. But so sign is hidden here inside this green block called the abs. It's another trigonometry function, and you don't really need to know how it works necessarily as much as you need to understand that when we get the sign of any number, let's say my variable here, let's set my variable to like 10 or something. It will always, the sign of a number will always be a number between 0 and, sorry, between -1 and 1. So let's try the sign of 11. So it's 0.19. The sign of 12 is 0.20. And if you graph this out, you'll see that this number, as my variable number grows, this number will get bigger faster and faster and faster until it starts to approach 1, and then it'll slow down and then start moving in the other direction. And the effect of this, if you use this for any kind of motion, is something a little bit like a pendulum, where it's swinging fast towards the middle and then slows down, and then swings fast in the other direction and then slows down. And that creates a very natural kind of movement cycle. So we like to use sign in a lot of our games whenever we have any kind of rotation or spinning that we want to look really natural and smooth. So we're going to be using this variable called time passed here, and that's just a number that's constantly going to be growing. We're going to find the sign of that number, and you see back here we're just making it increase by 1. The number's not really relevant as much as the fact that as that number changes, this number is going to swing between -1 and 1. So we can actually go point in direction now. I'm going to grab a point in direction 90, and we're going to tell it to point in the direction of the sign of time passed. Now, you're not going to be able to see a wiggle here because the wiggle is only 1 degree back and forth, which is so small that it's not even perceptible here. If you want it to be perceptible, we can take that number and multiply it by 50. So I'm going to go to my operators, grab a multiplication sign. So I'm going to go time passed times 50 and grab the sign of that number. And you're going to see that that's going to make that wiggle a lot more pronounced. So now you can see a wiggle that's actually perceptible here, right? We're going to add a little bit more speed to it in a second using some other variables, but that's the basic gist of it. All right, so sine of time passed times 50. Now, we're going to multiply that by another number. So the more numbers we multiply this by, the faster the wiggle's going to be. So the next thing we're going to multiply it by pop that. Oh, that's in the wrong spot. So put it in the pointed direction. So if we multiply this by yet another number, let's say 10 or something here, you're going to see that the wiggle is going to be even more pronounced. There we go. So that's quite an obvious wiggle, right? Good. All right. But what we want it wiggling when it's big and not wiggling when it's small. So what we can do here to code it in a really clever way is we can tell it to multiply the wiggle based on the size of the object. So if we take, let me just add the code here. I'm going to put a minus sign here to the right of the multiplication sign. I'm going to go to my looks, and at the very bottom, I'm going to grab this little block that says size, and I'm going to go size minus 10. So you remember that the minimum size something can be on the screen is 10, and the maximum size is 16. So when this is at its minimum size of 10, we're going to multiply this by 10 minus 10, which is 0, so times 0. And what that means is when it's at its minimum size, when we're not highlighted on it, it's not going to wiggle at all. But as it grows bigger, the wiggle's going to get bigger until it reaches its maximum size. There we go. So let's have a look at this now. You see it's not wiggling, and then when I move my cursor over it, it starts wiggling quite a bit because it's multiplying that number by 6, right? That 50 by 6. So this is the same as saying multiply this by 6. Let me show you that. But it's doing it all the time now, right? If I change this to size minus 10, then it's the same amount of wiggle, but it's only happening when the thing is big. Very clever little coding trick here. Okay, so this is wiggling nicely now. There's one subtle difference though, and it's going to be more important later on when we're playing with the arrow. But if you look carefully at the way this is wiggling, it's wiggling from an up position to a down position. Up, down, up, down, up, down. When we actually want it wiggling left to right. As I said, it's not that important for this block, but let's get it set up properly in any event. So I'm going to go stop. And I'm just going to offset all of this stuff by 90 to make it, just to rotate the final image 90 degrees here. So I'm just going to go to my operators. I'm going to grab a plus, and I'm going to take all of this code here, and I'm going to move it into the right-hand bubble and just take the output of that entire equation and add 90 to it. So when I pop this back in here, it doesn't change very much, but if you look in a very subtle way, you'll see that the wiggle is going left to right now instead of up to down. As I said, it's more important with the bow. All right, so we're almost done here. The last thing we have to do, though, is make sure these guys are wearing the right costume. So if I've clicked on it and the defense, that will make the defense block selected equals 0. Let's grab an if-else statement and pop it in here. So if defense block selected equals 0, which is what we enabled up top here. So we're going to go variables defense block selected equals 0. So if we are in wall building mode, we're going to want this graphic to turn green, and we're going to want it to wear the costume with the green ring around it. So let's go switch costumes to the one that's called selected. And otherwise, we're going to switch to unselected. So those are our two choices. So this code here will determine which costume it's wearing, whether if it's selected, which means you've clicked on it here and turned defense block selected to 0, then we're going to be wearing that costume with the green outline on it. Otherwise, we're going to be wearing the one with no outline on it, and it'll be unselected. Okay, now I'm not going to be able to demonstrate this until we add the code for a bow icon as well. So let's go ahead and do that right now. I'm just going to duplicate I'm going to drag all of this stack of code over on top of the icon bow so that it's a perfect copy over here. We don't need to copy over the smaller block of code which initializes our variables, because those have already been set and we don't need to do that twice. So over on the icon bow, there's a couple of little changes we have to make, but it's pretty much done. The first change we have to make is when we're moving hovering our mouse over this, there's a chance we could be hovering our mouse over transparent parts of the bow, which means it's not going to collide with our cursor and it's not going to wiggle properly. That can be frustrating. So the first thing that's going to happen when we move our mouse towards this is we're going to change this graphic to a big block that's easier to collide with. It doesn't have transparent holes in it. That block is called a mouse click hitbox. So right here in the code, right at the beginning of the if statement here, or the forever, before the if statement, we're going to switch our costume to mouse click hitbox right up here. And that will happen all instantaneously in the same frame where we end up switching costumes here. So that's not something that you'll actually be able to see in the final game. Okay, so that will give us a bigger hitbox to hover our mouse over. Now we need to change two more things here. First of all, if we're clicking on this, we're setting defense block selected to 1 rather than 0, because we're going to get into bow and arrow mode here. And if defense block selected is equal to 1, then that's selected as well. So we change that number to 1 as well. Okay, I think we can test that. I think we're pretty much ready to go here. So click the green flag, and you can see that this guy's wiggling quite nicely. When I click on him, he turns green. And when I click on him, he turns green beautifully. Okay, so this is looking very pro now. We just need to test it out here. So I'm going to hit my space bar, which is the hack that I created that gives me a bunch of stone and a bunch of gold here. So I should be in wall building mode here. Let's try building a wall. Beautiful. I'm going to build a single wall here and let this guy climb over it. Then I'll build a double one here. All right, so everything's working beautifully. Our creeper's coming up to mess up our day here. Let's let it blow stuff up. There we go. Now I'm going to create an archer. So I'm going to click on the archer, and then I'm going to click on top of this wall here. I'll click on top of the roof. And there we go. I've created a bunch of archers here. My money's going down the way that it's supposed to. All right, great. So this is all working exactly the way that we wanted it to, and now we can basically toggle back and forth between the two different modes. Okay, so that's quite a bit that we covered today, and I think we're trying to keep these tutorials fairly bite-sized, so I'm going to stop right here. So next week, we're going to go in and finish up this arrow code. So what we're going to do is we're going to use lists and some other fancy coding techniques to create clones of, here's our archer bow. So we're going to create this archer bow and actually have it place itself on top of each of these guys that we place down on the screen. And we're also going to have it have these guys rotate to point in whatever direction my cursor is pointing, so that all our archers are always shooting in the same direction. Then we're going to use some physics to create arrows that fly through the air and actually move in a way that's in accordance with the laws of physics, so that they go up and then gravity starts to pull them down again. So at that point, we'll actually be able to fight these enemies, and I'm very excited to show you that. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. It's going to be another 2 or 3 weeks before we're done, at least. Looks like we got, I really have no idea how long it's going to take us to teach this, but it's going to be a while. This is going to be one of our bigger projects here. So I hope you're enjoying this. Leave us a like, and definitely do subscribe to our channel if you like what we're doing here. And I will see you next week with part 4 of Minecraft Tower Defense. Thanks, guys.